when I was coming up as a young music lawyer working at MTV, I got exposed to all the different ways that, music is used in a creative process. At MTV, we had the VMAs and we had all of our music video programs and we had all of the ways that people were actually creating and doing stuff in and around music. And it allowed me to connect the dots with how important music was to me growing up. Sort of in the very developmental years, how music was impacting my ability to absorb information, my ability to understand things from different vantage points, my ability to be open to different cultures and different media formats.
You are listening to Notables, an Education Through Music podcast. I'm joined for this episode by Waleed Diab. Waleed is the Director and Global Head of Recorded Music Business Development for YouTube. Thanks so much for being here today, Waleed.
Thank you for having me.
Could you tell me a little bit about how you got started with music?
I was exposed to different types of music very early on. So I was born and raised in Maryland, but my family's from Egypt, and I actually used to go to Alexandria, Egypt each summer to visit my grandparents. And that was where I first started to be exposed to different types of music. So at the time, Egyptian pop music was really popular. And you'd walk down the streets in Alexandria and you'd just hear all this amazing music coming out of all the stores and the restaurants. And I was so impressed early on with how music just brought all the people together. Everybody seemed to know all the same songs and sing along to all of them. That had such a big impact on me because it allowed me to really kind of experience music's ability to bring culture and community to people, and also just see it as this really amazing art form that people could connect with, no matter who you were, old, young, whatever your background was, you had some ability to connect with it. And that was just really, really powerful for me. So when I would come back to the States, I'd bring back all these CDs from Egypt, and my brother, my sister, and I would sort of play them over and over and over again. And it was that time that I really fell in love with the format. It was just a great way to escape. It was a great way to open your mind, a great way to experience this really powerful art form and communication tool. And I think over the years, as I grew older, I started to really appreciate the importance of music as a part of culture. And I think, I had this added layer of growing up in a traditional Arab American Muslim household where music had a valuable position. And I saw how my parents sort of revered older music from their generation. But at the same time, you had the confluence of this conservative sect of Islam taking over the Middle East. And they was actually pushing back on music as part of culture. It was very clearly kind of considered the work of the devil, or something that was going to pull people away from God, and I had a lot of problems with that. For me personally, it just felt like, why would you take this beautiful, rich culture and kind of push it underground or tell people they couldn't participate in it? And so that has been, I think, a constant strain for me throughout my career as something that, I wanted to be part of the counterpoint to that, part of the industry that's actually allowing people to experience this art form, allowing people to create, allowing people to find careers. Because I think it's so obvious that the next great composer or lyricist or creator may never go into that because they've been brainwashed to believe oh, no, this is a bad thing, you can't do this. It was obviously a very big part of my youth growing up. And I think also it allowed me, as sort of an Arab American kid that was exposed to, on this side, I was growing up listening to hip hop and Biggie and Tupac and Wu-Tang Clan and the Cranberries and Tony Braxton and all these kind of Western artists, and just seeing how, different cultures and different people were expressing their stories and communicating in this beautiful way. So, and just contrasting that to the Egyptian experience and how people were making music there and why music sounded differently. And, Egyptian music was more percussive, it was more dance-like, and just kind of seeing that was very, very interesting because it kind of allowed your brain to expand and see things from different vantage points.
One of the threads that I'm hearing that really stands out to me, knowing what I know about your career, is this idea of different forms of music all being accessible around the world. So if you're picking up music in Egypt, but then listening to these CDs over and over again in Maryland, that is a form of access that wouldn't have existed many years ago. These different art forms would have stayed sort of insulated from each other.
Totally.
And in 2016, you were listed among Billboard's 40 Under 40 for your work in the licensing deals that made the Google Play Store accessible in 60 territories around the world. And I think that that's such an interesting thread, that this experience early on might have oriented you towards making music a little more accessible.
100%. Absolutely. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when, the only way to get music was you had to go to the store and buy it, Right. So whether I was in the States, in Maryland, waiting in line at Tower Records, or at Walmart, they used to have the big, display cases with the CDs right up at the front when you walked in. But they were obviously only selling music that was going to be really popular there because the costs were really expensive, right? You had to go press CDs, you had to, market them, and then you had to ship them and deliver them to stores, and then the stores had to dedicate floor space for them.
Right.
And then the same thing in Egypt. In Egypt, actually, most of the music I bought was from like bodegas or like these carts that kind of were perched outside the beach, and you'd walk by and the guy in the cart would be, selling hot dogs, corn, and CDs, and you'd just be playing it. But he also was, selling inventory that he had to carry and he had to pay for, and then he had to distribute and pay back the distributors for. Obviously, the costs for that don't lend themselves to like bringing in really obscure or random music from all different parts of the world. Well, cut to, the 2000s when all of a sudden now we moved to a streaming world and you can have access to everything. You can actually get all this really random, obscure music because the cost of, duplicating and distributing online is much lower. That was like the panacea for me. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I get to get access to all this music from all these random parts of the world. And so to me, it's a beautiful thing. Like the streaming world has ushered in this era of, broad distribution and broad access to music for everybody everywhere, which is, it's funny. I look at my nieces and my nephews now, and they've only ever lived in a world of total streaming abundance, right. Like where you have access to everything. And it's clear that has benefited them because people get these, interests for music from all different parts of the world. That's one of the things I love the most about working at YouTube is the biggest, broadest, and most widely available music service. And it has a place for everybody. So that helps both the fans and the artists because the artists can find audiences in places they never thought they would find audiences. We talk a lot about music export, right? Like the fact that people might be creating music in Colombia that happens to be very popular in South Korea. Or people are creating music in South Korea that's like really, really popular in the United States. Those are things that didn't exist in the old world. I mean, they did to a lesser extent, but like because the cost structure was so heavy and the cost of marketing and building awareness was so difficult, you didn't see it quite as much. And so it's one of the things actually that drives me the most about the work that I do at YouTube is really building that broadly available democratic distribution platform that is allowing, artists to discover music from all over the world and musicians to discover fans and build audiences all over the world.
There's a moment that happened sort of between the physical CD reality of music and the streaming reality of music, which was like the piracy reality of music.
Yeah.
And so that I think that in some ways democratized music and sort of like set the stage for people expecting as listeners and consumers of music to have access to all of these artists that they wouldn't necessarily have been able to find in physical CDs at Walmart, or they wouldn't have invested the money to buy the physical CDs at Walmart.
Right.
the piece that was missing and the piece that made that unsustainable was that, for a period of time, artists weren't getting paid for their music. And that was a huge problem especially for smaller artists.
Totally.
It was the bigger artists who sort of raised a legal stink over it. But the smaller artists, and there's a lot going on behind the scenes, those people weren't getting paid.
Exactly. And I think I remember that. I mean, I remember I was in college when Napster came out, and I remember there was this huge cultural backlash, right, that was happening against the music industry at the time, because there was a very prevalent feeling that people had been taken advantage of, right? You were going in and buying CDs for, at the time, they went up to $19.99. Sometimes they were more than $20. Yeah. And maybe you'd like, 2 or 3 songs on the album. I was sort of joking with a friend of mine the other day that the younger generation doesn't know what it's like to be forced to listen to a whole album over and over and over again just because you spent $20 on it,
right,
Right. And so when Napster came along and said, hey, you can actually just download the exact songs that you want, or you can go and get access to all these other albums that you, like you said, that you wouldn't have purchased. There was obviously a huge demand for that on the user side. But all of the business aspects of it hadn't been figured out. So as you said, artists weren't getting paid. The music was being pirated and looted just widely. And that's just unsustainable, because that doesn't provide any incentives for people to continue investing in the creative aspects of the music industry, right? Then nobody is going to say like, oh, let me go become an artist and just like be poor for the rest of my life. Right. And it took a long time for those pieces to come together. I think the music industry was very resistant early on to like agreeing to some new model. But, I think to their credit and to the credit of the DSPs like YouTube and Spotify and Apple and everybody else, we eventually figured out a model that worked, that actually does allow music to flow back to the pockets of artists and creators. I mean, we are really, really proud of the business we've built at YouTube. I mean, over the past 12 months, we paid out $6 billion to the music industry. That's a ton of money. I mean, right. When you think about the scale of that business to drive that amount of money into the pockets of, artists, creators, songwriters, and that took a while. That didn't happen overnight, because you had to both train the users to pay for music so that they could understand, okay, now I'm paying, $10 a month or whatever it is for a music subscription service. But we also generate money from ads, right? So for users that don't want to subscribe to a service, they can watch, advertisements and get the free access to the music that way. So those things are really, really great to see that the model is working out. But there's always disruption. Like even now, as we are in a much more mature streaming market and a much more mature advertising market, we're seeing things like TikTok come along, and which is creating sort of the atomization of music. Like I say the atomization of music, it's basically like taking a sound recording and then just focusing on 15 seconds of it or 10 seconds of it. And then all the kids know just that 15 seconds, but they don't actually care about the rest of the song, nor do they care about the rest of the repertoire of the artist. That's also dangerous. That's in some ways that's more dangerous than the previous revolution that we went through by Napster and the sort of, people accessing everything for free, because now these kids they're not even developing any type of connection with the artist. At least when, it's so funny, I feel like so old talking about this, but like when I was in college and we were using Napster, you still had this idea of like who the artists were and who the creators were that you kind of wanted to build a connection with. And I think that's being lost as part of this next step evolution into short form video. But the good thing is we have been thinking a lot about this at YouTube and trying to build a feedback loop so that when people are consuming short form video and they're consuming just that 15-second, loop from a song, that's that's kind of their entryway to an artist. And then we want to take them from that and bring them to that artist premium music videos so they can see like how the artist would tell a story over 3 or 4 minutes. Mm-hmm. And then obviously also bring them to that artist's like albums and the rest of their repertoire so that users are not just sort of stuck in this like really, really short feedback loop of like a 15-second clip, but they're actually going in and really diving into everything that artist has created. So it's interesting. Like I guess just to summarize, like we've been through huge disruption. We found ways to drive money back to artists and creators, but we have to keep working at it because technology keeps developing and keeps advancing. And with each development and each advancement, there's like new challenges for how we must like drive that money back to the artists.
And now for a short break. This podcast is brought to you by Education Through Music. ETM is a nonprofit organization that partners with under-resourced schools to provide music as a core subject for all children and utilizes music education as a catalyst to improve overall achievement, motivation, and self-confidence among students. To learn more or support the work of Education Through Music, check out etmonline.org. You graduated from University of Maryland at College Park and then went directly to law school, which really set the stage for you to dive into the industry and get started with this work that you've been doing ever since. So I'm curious, what sort of picture did you have in your head of the work that you would be doing after law school?
So to be totally frank, I didn't have any picture at all. I decided to go to law school kind of as a fluke, and I basically decided to go to law school as a way of avoiding growing up and getting a real job. My parents, my mom was a doctor and my dad was an engineer, and I knew I didn't want to do either of those fields. They encouraged us really heavily to get to have some type of professional degree and become some type of professional. So I had ruled out medicine and I had ruled out engineering. And then when I was getting ready to graduate undergrad, I had a degree in finance and marketing, and I wanted to go do some type of grad school. I looked at business school, but I couldn't get into business school straight out of undergrad. And so law school was the winner. And I basically decided last minute during my senior year that I was going to take the LSAT and apply to law school. And I did that, came to law school in New York in 2001. And it was then that I started to look at okay, what can I actually do with a legal degree? And that's when I connected the dots back to media and music. And then it became my focus. But it was only after I started law school. And then actually in law school, I tried a bunch of different things. I mean, at one point I was going to be a bankruptcy lawyer because I was just really interested in the bankruptcy process and, the rules and all that sort of thing. But music, obviously having been one of my lifelong passions, was the winner. I started to seek out internships. I found an internship that was with a media company, allowed me to learn some of the skills I needed. And then ultimately I was able to parlay that experience into a job at MTV right out of law school that allowed me to focus on music and media, and things sort of developed from there. But it definitely was not preordained. I didn't think about it until, much later. And I think having come back to it and seeing, the business side of it and seeing, the legal side of it, and to understanding all the infrastructure of the music industry, it's a very complex space with lots of different stakeholders and lots of different, rights holders. But I think ultimately it's all in furtherance of, this really, really important, part of our culture, this really, really important art form that is so widely accessible and so widely appreciated. It doesn't matter what your background is or how old or young you are, people have some experience with music, some connection to it. And I think that's just beautiful. It's important to be open to different experiences. And that's why we go to school, is to try and figure out, okay, what's our spot? How are we going to add value? How are we going to make a difference? And for me, I was lucky enough to steer myself towards music. And, it's funny, everything's much clearer in hindsight. It's funny because when I was growing up, my parents didn't let me watch MTV. We weren't allowed to have it. Sometimes I would watch it through the squiggly lines. If there was an award show, I was like, oh, I gotta kind of see what's going on in this music video. And so it was always funny to me, and it was a big irony that I ended up working at MTV. Right. But I think it's also part of my story as to why I really wanted to be in music, was because of this. I saw how it has the power to change culture and the power to influence people and the power to give people this really, really powerful outlet that's creative and allows them to connect with so many different voices and so many different ideas. And I grew up in a pretty strict household where, everything was by the book, and, we studied religion, and we had to kind of, we were good kids, we weren't bad kids, but everything was very, very strict. And to me, music was always an outlet. It was always this creative way of escaping from everything. And so to me, making that available to kids and making sure that they have at least the opportunity to consider the world from that vantage point is really, really important work.
Thanks so much, Waleed, for being here and for sharing your story with us.
Thank you so much. No, this is great. I really appreciate you guys doing this.